The house was silent, but the investigation had just begun to speak. Betrayal inside the circle of trust. The Harvey Family Murders. The house revealed no struggle, no forced entry, no sign of chaos. What it revealed instead was something far more unsettling. Everything was exactly where it should be. Police units began arriving at the Harvey home within minutes of the emergency call. What had started as a quiet welfare concern instantly transformed into a secured crime scene. Patrol cars lined the street, blocking off access from both ends. Officers moved quickly but carefully, aware that every step taken inside and around the house now carried evidentiary weight. The stillness of the neighborhood was replaced with flashing lights and controlled urgency. Neighbors who had been going about an ordinary holiday morning began to gather at a distance, watching in silence as the reality of what had happened slowly became visible. As the home was officially sealed, detectives were brought in and the perimeter was expanded. No one was allowed to enter without clearance. The street, once familiar and unremarkable, was now dominated by police tape and marked vehicles. Conversations among officers were quiet and focused. This was already being treated as a major homicide investigation. The fact that 4 people from the same family had been found dead inside a single residence elevated the case immediately. Inside the house, the methodical work began. Photographs were taken. Evidence markers were placed. The position of each victim was documented with precision. Every room was treated as a separate piece of the larger puzzle. Nothing was moved unnecessarily. Nothing was assumed. At this stage, investigators were not searching for conclusions. They were collecting facts, one detail at a time, building a foundation for whatever story the evidence would eventually reveal. Outside, the impact on the neighborhood was immediate and heavy. Rumors traveled faster than confirmed information. Some neighbors whispered about what they thought they had heard during the night. Others insisted they had noticed nothing at all. Fear spread quietly. A sense of safety that had defined the area was suddenly fractured. People looked at their own locked doors differently. The idea that an entire family could be killed inside a home like this, without warning, without noise, without witnesses, unsettled everyone who lived nearby. At this early stage, police offered no public explanation, no details about a suspect, no discussion of motive, only confirmation of what had happened. 4 people were dead inside the Harvey residence, and an active investigation was underway. The absence of answers created a vacuum that filled quickly with speculation, but investigators remained focused on the scene itself, because the house was about to deliver one of its most important messages, a detail that would quietly but decisively change how the entire case would be understood. As investigators moved through the house with greater precision, the early facts of the crime scene began to take shape. What they found was not what many would expect after a violent mass killing. There were no shattered windows, no broken door frames, no signs that someone had forced their way inside during the night. The entry points to the home were intact. Locks were undisturbed. Nothing suggested a struggle at the threshold. Even more striking was what had not been taken. Personal belongings remained where they would normally be found. Electronics were still inside the home. Money, jewelry, and valuables were not obviously missing. The scene did not resemble a burglary interrupted or a robbery gone wrong. There was no evidence that the home had been ransacked in search of anything. The interior of the house also told a restrained story. Furniture had not been overturned. Objects were not scattered in panic. The rooms were not marked by widespread physical disorder. Whatever violence had taken place, it had not exploded outward in chaos. It had moved through the home with a controlled finality that left the environment eerily intact. This contradicted many early assumptions. In cases involving multiple victims, investigators often see signs of pursuit, rooms torn apart, traces of frantic movement, a trail of destruction from one space to another. But inside the Harvey home, the lack of visible turmoil suggested something far more deliberate. This was not an uncontrolled outburst. It was not random. At this stage, investigators still had not publicly identified the weapon used or the exact sequence of events that led to all 4 deaths. But the condition of the house had already delivered one of the case's most important early truths. This crime did not begin with forced entry, and it did not end with theft. The scene pointed away from strangers and toward familiarity, and with that realization, the direction of the investigation quietly began to shift. As the initial findings were reviewed, the focus of the investigation began to change in a subtle but decisive way. From the outside, the house had offered no sign of intrusion. From the inside, it had revealed no pattern of theft. These 2 facts alone forced investigators to reconsider the most basic assumption of violent crime, that danger usually comes from the outside. Here, the evidence did not support that idea. If no one had broken in, then someone had been let in. If nothing had been taken, then the motive was not financial. This narrowed the field of possibility dramatically. The person responsible was not acting at random. They were not searching for valuables. They were not moving through unfamiliar territory. They knew where they were. They knew who was inside, and they had access without resistance. This realization quietly redirected the investigation away from strangers and toward the family's inner circle. Detectives began to focus less on unknown intruders and more on relationships. Who had regular access to the house? Who was trusted? Who could arrive at the door late at night without raising alarm? Who knew the family's routines, their schedules, their vulnerabilities? Mechanics replaced mystery. Investigators started building a timeline not just of the night itself, but of the days and weeks leading up to it. They examined phone records, they traced recent visits, they identified the people who had moved in and out of the family's life without drawing attention. Each connection was logged, reviewed, and reconsidered under a new light. What had once looked like a quiet, uneventful life now became a web of interactions that demanded scrutiny. Conversations that once meant nothing were now reinterpreted. Ordinary disagreements took on new meaning. Familiar faces became potential suspects. And among those familiar faces, one presence would soon separate itself from the rest, not through chaos or open threat, but through access, proximity, and a connection that was impossible to ignore. The scene was quiet. The truth was not. As news of the Harvey family murders spread through Richmond, the shock moved faster than confirmed facts. By the afternoon, the street outside their home was no longer private. It had become a gathering point for police vehicles, reporters, and neighbors searching for answers they did not yet have. People who had lived on that street for years began to look at their surroundings differently. The idea that an entire family could be killed inside a quiet home without any warning signs reaching outside unsettled the city at its core. Fear did not arrive loudly. It moved in quietly, through conversations behind closed doors, through phone calls between relatives, through a sudden awareness of locked windows and checked doors. Parents held their children closer that night. Neighbors spoke in lowered voices. The assumption that safety was guaranteed by familiarity had been broken. This had not happened in a dark alley or a distant part of town. It had happened in a place that looked exactly like thousands of other neighborhoods across the city. For investigators, the pressure intensified immediately. 4 victims, 1 household, no forced entry, no robbery, no strangers seen fleeing the scene. The absence of chaos made the crime harder to explain, not easier. Every hour without answers increased the weight of expectation on the investigation. The public wanted to know who could do this, and more importantly, why. What made the case even more disturbing was how quickly one truth began to take shape beneath the uncertainty. This was not a crime driven by opportunity. It was not the result of a random encounter. It had been carried out by someone who did not need to fight their way inside, someone who did not need to search for what they wanted, someone who moved through that home with purpose. The danger had not come from the outside. It had come from within the circle of trust. And while the city of Richmond tried to make sense of what had happened inside that house on the first day of the year, investigators were already closing in on a connection that would soon turn this case from a mystery into a revelation, one that would expose just how close the killer had been to the family all along. But as investigators began reviewing the family's recent connections, one detail quietly rose to the surface, a detail that shifted the emotional weight of the entire case. The person they would soon focus on was not a stranger, not a shadow moving in the dark, not a figure passing briefly through the family's life. This was someone who had been inside that home before. Someone who knew the layout of the rooms, someone who understood the rhythm of the household, someone who was familiar enough to be trusted without hesitation. The realization was deeply unsettling, because it meant that the Harvey family had not been targeted by chance. They had not crossed paths with a threat they could see coming. The danger had moved through a door that had once been opened willingly, and the person now drawing investigators' attention had not forced their way into this family's world. They had already been a part of it. At this stage, police still had no public suspect, but privately, their focus had narrowed. The answers they were searching for were no longer hidden in the neighborhood or in the city beyond. They were buried inside the family's closest circle. And the question that now haunted the investigation was no longer who could have done this. It had become something far more disturbing. Who did they trust? Who never should have been trusted at all? On the night of December 31st, 2005, while most of Richmond was preparing to welcome a new year, the Harvey family was doing something far less dramatic. According to records later reviewed by investigators, there was no confirmed large gathering at the house that night, no reported party, no documented visitors coming and going. The evening appeared on the surface to be quiet and ordinary. Phone records showed that the family remained in contact with the outside world during the final hours of the year. Calls were made, messages were exchanged. Nothing in those communications immediately suggested panic, fear, or an awareness that danger was approaching. To anyone looking only at the digital footprint, it looked like a normal night winding down. Inside the home, the routine of a family evening appeared to have followed its usual rhythm. There was no sign that the house had been prepared for guests, no indication that an argument had erupted loudly enough for neighbors to hear. Whatever took place that night did not announce itself through noise or public disturbance. Yet investigators would later determine that somewhere between the final hours of December 31st and the early morning of January 1st, the Harvey family's routine was violently interrupted. What makes this window of time especially critical is that it represents the last period in which the family can be traced as fully alive through verifiable data. After that point, their digital presence abruptly ends. No outgoing calls, no messages, no activity that could be linked to conscious movement inside the house. This silence is not just dramatic, it is forensic. Because in modern investigations, the absence of digital activity often speaks as loudly as its presence. The moment devices fall quiet, timelines begin to narrow. Investigators use that silence to estimate not only when life stopped, but when someone else may have entered the picture. What remains particularly disturbing about this final night is how unremarkable it appears in the records. There is no dramatic last call, no frantic message, no emergency signal, no clear warning left behind in the data. Whatever happened inside that house unfolded without producing a digital trace that would immediately alert the outside world. That absence of alarm would later become one of the most haunting aspects of the case, because it meant that the people inside the house likely never had the chance to call for help. And it meant that when the danger arrived, it did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as something quiet, something allowed inside. Before their home became the center of a homicide investigation, the Harvey family existed only as private individuals living an ordinary life. To the outside world, they were not public figures. They held no fame, no controversy, no visible connection to crime. That is precisely why their identities would later become so important to understanding the scale of what was lost. The parents were working adults with defined daily routines. Employment records showed consistent schedules, steady income, and no history of financial instability severe enough to suggest desperation or conflict driven by money. Their lives revolved around work during the day and family responsibilities in the evening. Nothing in their professional histories suggested affiliations with dangerous environments or high-risk behavior. Their trajectory was stable, predictable, and firmly rooted in normalcy. The children were students. Their school lives reflected structure, attendance records, academic expectations, extracurricular routines. Teachers and school contacts later described them as ordinary children growing up within a disciplined household. There were no documented behavioral crises, no disciplinary histories that pointed to turmoil at home. To classmates, they were peers. To educators, they were just another set of names on a class list. No warning signs were flagged in that world either. Socially, the family was neither isolated nor deeply woven into constant public activity. They had a circle that appeared modest and contained. They interacted with neighbors, maintained familiar connections, and moved through the same quiet patterns as most families in their community. Their home was not a place of frequent gatherings or public scenes. It was private, quiet, routine-driven. From a distance, the picture that emerges is not one of visible conflict. There were no protective orders filed, no police calls for disturbances, no documented domestic violence reports, no pattern of repeated emergency visits to the home. For investigators, this absence of red flags created a fundamental problem. There was no obvious narrative to explain why this family, on this night, would become the target of such extreme violence. This lack of visible instability would later force detectives to look beyond surface-level explanations. because when a family with no public history of crisis is suddenly wiped out, the source of danger is rarely found in random encounters. It is usually buried in relationships that appear stable until pressure exposes what was hidden. And it is at this point in the investigation that attention began to shift, away from the neighborhood, away from strangers, and toward the private connections that operated inside the family's everyday life. The people who knew their schedules, their habits, their trust. Because the key to understanding what happened would not come from who the Harvey family was in public. It would come from who they allowed into their private world. The relationship that would ultimately sit at the center of the investigation did not begin as something alarming. On the surface, it appeared ordinary, even supportive. This person was not a stranger drifting at the edges of the Harvey family's life. They were present in it, familiar enough to move within it without raising questions, trusted enough to cross the boundary between public life and private space. Records showed repeated contact, not sporadic, not accidental, the kind of contact that only develops through routine and access. This person knew when the family was usually home. They understood the rhythm of the household. They could arrive without causing surprise. That level of familiarity is not built overnight, and it is not given lightly. Investigators quickly recognized how critical this was. In cases where forced entry is absent, access becomes the central key. And in this case, access was not theoretical, it was documented. This person had been inside the home before. They had means of entry that did not require breaking anything. They were not treated as an intruder. What made the situation even more disturbing was how normal the connection looked to the outside world. Neighbors did not report fear. There were no public disputes, no visible tensions that suggested volatility. To anyone watching casually, the relationship appeared unremarkable. That illusion of normalcy became one of the most dangerous elements in the case. Behind that appearance, however, investigators would later identify underlying dynamics that were not visible in daily gestures. The balance of power within the relationship, the emotional positioning, the expectations attached to loyalty, access, and trust. These elements do not show themselves through public conflict. They reveal themselves only when pressure collapses the structure holding them in place. The family did not appear to recognize any immediate threat connected to this individual. There were no documented attempts to distance themselves, no requests for police help, no formal boundaries established through legal means. Whatever concerns may have existed, they were either unspoken or underestimated. The door remained open, both literally and metaphorically. This is where the meaning of betrayal becomes central to the case, because betrayal does not come from strangers. It comes from those who are close enough to be trusted without resistance, those who move through familiar spaces without challenge, those whose presence feels harmless, until it is not. By the time investigators fully understood the depth of this connection, the crime could no longer be framed as an invasion from the outside. It had emerged from within the family's own circle. The person now under scrutiny had not discovered the family that night. They already knew them. And that single fact would reshape every explanation that followed about motive, timing, and the quiet way the danger had entered the Harvey home without a struggle. At first, the house was the mystery. Now, the people inside it were. The danger no longer came from the street or the dark beyond the door. It came from within the circle they trusted most. Next on True Echoes. The trust, the betrayal, and the moment everything finally collapsed, the city fell silent, and all that remained was the family's closest secret, when trust became the weapon. The truth coming soon on True Echoes. What do you believe was the true beginning of the end? The night itself, the house without forced entry, or the person who was never questioned at first? Tell us what you think in the comments. We're listening. To be continued.